John Bolton isn't the conventional State Department man. He's been called both the poster child of what someone in the diplomatic corps should not be, and the kind of man with whom I would want to stand at Armageddon. Way back in 1998, he was arguing for removing Saddam Hussein by force. As Under-Secretary for Defense in 2001, he played a key role in President Bush's policy towards Iraq and the so-called Axis of Evil. He said the only language that rogue states understood was the language of force, regime change. He had little or no time for multinational negotiations. So it wasn't surprising that George Bush's decision to appoint him US ambassador to the UN was seen by many as a clear statement of US intent.
The Secretariat building in New York has 38 stories. If you lost 10 stories today, it wouldn't make a bit of difference. The only question to the United States is what's in our national interest.
But when discontent over Iraq led to the Republicans losing control of Congress and it was clear his appointment wouldn't be confirmed, he walked. Since then, some of the neoconservatives have begun to question whether the Iraq strategy was right after all, and some of their number are now contemplating a different approach to Iran and Syria. So, has John Bolton too had a change of heart? I asked John Bolton whether 4 years ago, when he was drumming up support for the invasion of Iraq, he imagined things would become as bad as they are in the country.
I did not, because I imagined largely that well before this point the United States would have turned responsibility for the governance and the security of Iraq back over to Iraqis.
So that was the big mistake, was it?
I think analytically there are two questions here to look back on and to learn lessons from. The first question, was it right to overthrow Saddam Hussein? That seems to me to be yes, unquestionably, knowing everything we know now. The second question analytically is what to do after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, and that's where I think reasonable people can disagree about the consequences. But where we are today is because of the second question, not the first.
And that was absence of planning for what would follow the invasion.
No, I think actually there were lots of plans. I think the real problem was in not relying more on Iraqis. The basic difficulty, I think, under dictatorship is there's no political culture. And I think to have stability in Iraq, you have to have Iraqis dealing with each other in a civil way. By imposing the coalition authority for a year, we denied the Iraqis at least a year of learning how to live with each other. I don't think you breed political maturation by making decisions for other people. So in 2020 hindsight, and I confess it's hindsight, that was a mistake, obviously.
Of course there's no culture of democracy under a dictatorship, but what you do have under a dictatorship is a great apparatus of the state. Was it a mistake to de-Ba'athify try to de-Ba'athify the whole apparatus and thereby dismantle it?
No, I don't think that part was a mistake. I think the decisions that were made in retrospect, such as dismantling the army that have caused so much difficulty, may or may not have been handled differently if Iraqis themselves had been making the decisions. That's why I don't think there's an American interest in what kind of Iraq emerges from the present circumstance. I think the American strategic interest is in making sure that no part of Iraq be used by terrorists as a base against us. That's what we should focus on, not how to structure the country. That's what we should have left to the Iraqis earlier to see if they could work it out themselves.
That isn't what you said at the time, of course.
Oh, I think at the time I was following the administration policy because I'm part of the administration. I think it's important to be loyal to the policy at the top. When you're not able to do that anymore, it's time to get out.
So when you said the United States remains committed to a unified, democratic and prosperous Iraq, you were just spouting the party line, were you?
Well, that's one way to look at it. I think that in a system of representative government such as we have, your loyalty as a senior official has to be to what Jim Baker, former Secretary of State, called the guy who got elected. That was his policy, and I was loyal to it. I think that was my responsibility. What my personal views are is something else.
Is there not an American responsibility, having invaded a country, dismantled all the apparatus of government, to ensure that the citizens of that country are not murdered
I think it's the responsibility which we've tried to fulfill to turn it back over to the Iraqis. I think I said at the outset of this interview, we made a mistake in hindsight not turning it over to them earlier. But we don't have a responsibility to make the government of Iraq succeed. That's their responsibility.
You have a responsibility to keep the peace or not?
I think that's their responsibility too. I think we're all agreed the sooner the Iraqis can decide whether they're going to do that or not, the better off everybody is.
You sound as if you're washing your hands of the whole affair.
No. I said at the beginning there are two questions analytically here. The first question, whether it was right to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and the answer to that still seems to be unquestionably yes. The second question, what to do after that. And I think it's perfectly obvious, given the circumstances, that we should have handled it differently. And what I would have done differently is much earlier, much sooner after the overthrow, given it back to the Iraqis. And I'll exaggerate for effect here, but given them a copy of the Federalist Papers and said, good luck.
What do you say when people turn to you and say, okay, Saddam Hussein was a dictator, but Iraq was not then a failed state, and it was not a haven for terrorists, and that's precisely what you've created in Iraq?
Well, that's great. You'd rather live in a dictatorship than a failed state. That's your preference. That wouldn't be my preference. And what you had in that dictatorship was a person who had accumulated and used chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq War, had used chemical weapons against the Kurds, his own fellow citizens, had kept together over 1,000 scientists and technicians to rebuild his nuclear weapons program, a group he called his Nuclear Mujahideen.
Sure. Except, of course, he didn't have any weapons of mass destruction, did he?
Well, let's be clear what he was doing. I mentioned before he kept 1,000 nuclear mujahideen together. That's what you need for a nuclear weapons program. The materials, the technology, all flow out of the intellectual property that those scientists possess.
But this claim turned out to be a lie, Mr. Bolton, didn't it?
No, you're quite wrong on that. The capability that Saddam kept was not physical pieces of equipment, but the intellectual capability to recreate the nuclear program.
We were told by no less a person than your own Secretary of State that he had an active and ongoing program for acquiring and developing weapons of mass destruction.
And I fully believe that, that all of the evidence on that is not yet in, and it was never the American claim. It was your British problem, but it was never the American claim that Saddam's weapons of mass destruction programs constituted an imminent threat. What we said, and what was approved by broad majorities of both parties in both houses of our Congress, that the threat was the regime itself.
Do you at least accept that what has happened in Iraq has done immense damage to your attempts to deal with other states which definitely do have a program for developing and acquiring weapons of mass destruction?
Well, it has caused damage because there are some faint hearts in places nearer to where you're speaking from than where I'm speaking from that have allowed themselves to be intimidated by the claims and by the programs of these other countries. Some of that intimidation has even occurred here in Washington, but it hasn't intimidated me.